Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Since we are running slightly behind schedule, I will keep my introductory comments very brief, and my plan for the panel discussion is to ask actually one question for each of the panelists, and at that point immediately take also questions and feedback from the audience, so we can try to keep this very interactive, and we'll see if we can close things more or less on schedule, maybe a little bit after 1. At 1 o'clock, I would also like to take a group photo. So just to announce it now, if I could, at the end of this panel, ask everyone to stay, eventually come up to the stage. We will try to do a photo with all of the participants and the speakers who are here. This is something we can then send to you afterwards and as a nice reminder of the event. So just make a note, right after this panel discussion, we'll do a group photo. I see there are some others joining us in the back. Feel free to come towards the front where there are still some empty seats. Okay, so let's begin. The topic for the panel discussion is national brands, state-sponsored cultural institutions, and cultural identity. The role of art and culture in expressing, protecting, and promoting national identities. This is a topic that fascinates me a lot. Of course, as the director and founder of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, every day almost I'm reflecting, and I'm also getting requests from governments around the world, what should governments do? And I think there, if you look at different countries around the world, they actually embrace culture in very different ways. As many of you know, I'm American in background. The United States doesn't have a Minister of Culture. So in that sense, it's a very different approach than in France, where not only do they have a Ministry of Culture, but actually in France still today, they spend over 1% of their GDP on culture. So very different approaches to culture around the world. The U.S., if I can generalize, is more or less their approach. Culture, that's something for the citizens. Very often, culture is looked upon as something of the private sector. Culture is a product that can be sold, whether it's a Hollywood film or a CD, etc. There's very little involvement of the government, aside from, as we were discussing over dinner last night, a wonderful tax incentive for Americans to actually contribute to nonprofits or to charities. So that's maybe one way we could look at how the American government does try to encourage American citizens to get involved. And there, statistically, actually, American citizens, I think, are the most generous in the world in terms of money they actually give to charities. Not because Americans, I think, are nicer than anyone else, but they do have a big tax incentive. So that's one way of trying to inspire also an involvement in the arts. France, if I could look at it for a moment, has two approaches. I would label it, roughly speaking, as what I would call negative culture diplomacy and positive culture diplomacy. By negative, what I mean is where the French government sees its role is actually to protect French culture in certain ways by having, for example, quotas on the radio. So a certain percentage of music on the French radio needs to be in French. A certain percentage can be in other languages. There's the Académie Française, that, of course, one of their tasks is to maintain the purity of the French language, to make sure that foreign influences don't come in, and the French language maintains a purity, as they say. So that's one approach. Governments can say, okay, let's close borders. Let's make it more difficult for certain exchanges to take place in order to protect our cultures. So that's one approach we could consider. Another approach is where governments say, hey, look, it's our role to take taxpayers' euros or taxpayers' dollars and to support culture in terms of its creation as well as its promotion abroad. Again, looking at the French case, a recent movie that I think many of us have seen and love, Le Fabuleux Destin d'Émilie Poulain, Emily, their fabelhaft Abenteuer von Emily, I think is the German title. Very successful film coming from France around the world. That film would not have been possible were it not for governmental subsidies. So a great example where actually the French government says, look, we've got to actually help create culture and support it. Otherwise, it may not be created. The opera is another great example. In Germany, of course, the German opera would not be around were it not for governmental support. In New York, it's totally privately funded, the Metropolitan Opera. So again, I pose that as a question. Should governments be involved in creating culture? Should they be making choices in terms of what culture is created and what culture is not created? If you were to take a democratic vote in Germany, would you like your taxpayers' euros to go to the opera? It would never work. German citizens as a whole would never agree in a consensus, yes, with unemployment and all these other priorities, let's support the opera. However, every year, money goes to the opera. Is this good? Is this bad? I don't know. I'm just making reference to different ways in which governments are embracing culture. And that's actually the question that I'd like to ask each of the panelists. This is an opportunity for you to offer some opening remarks in terms of, as we talk about this issue of state-sponsored culture diplomacy or state institutions for culture diplomacy, my main question is, should governments be involved in culture? If so, how should they be involved? Is it the government's job to protect borders? For example, Latvia, let's say a small member of the European country. Should Latvia now have quotas on the radio, blocking foreign languages and really promoting Latvian and having most of the radio in Latvian, taking the French model? Or should we be doing the opposite? Programs like Erasmus, which are exchange programs, making it easier to move back and forth between borders. What role, if any, should governments have? Or should they just take the American model and say, look, that's not our business, and not even have a Minister of Culture? So that's my main question. We luckily have a very international panel. We've had the chance to get to know actually all of the speakers on this panel except for one, who I'm very happy to have here, having traveled all the way from Turkey. And I just want to say a few words about her, so you know a little bit of her background. We'll have the pleasure of getting to know her also a little bit later this week. I'm referring to Professor Tomur Atagok. She's a professor and dean of the Art and Design faculty of Yildiz University. She was born in Istanbul, having graduated from the American College for Girls in 1959. She continued her education in plastic arts in the Oklahoma State University with a BFA and California College of Arts and Crafts. She completed her MA in plastic arts at the University of California, Berkeley in 1965. Her first solo exhibition was held in 1966 at the Istanbul State Academy of Fine Arts Gallery. Since then, she has had numerous solo and group exhibitions all over the world, including England, France, Egypt, Algeria, and the United States. She started her work at the Mir Sinan University Sculpture and Painting Museum as the director's assistant in 1980. In 1984, she became the director of Culture, Press, and Foreign Relations at the Yildiz University. She attended UNESCO artist activities in Romania and Greece and represented Turkey in 1997. She became a tenured professor in 1993. Apart from her work as an artist, she has also written many essays on museum studies and organized and held many conferences with notable figures. And again, this is an individual whose CV is far too large to do justice to it in a brief introduction, but to at least allow a little bit of insight in terms of the wealth of experience that also Professor Atagok has had. We're very happy that you're able to join us, also for the next few days in the conference. Ambassador Simonyi, Professor Buttiglione, and also Ms. Hennicot-Schoepges, we had the chance to get to know already, so I'll skip over the introductions, and I'll jump right into my first question, and maybe we'll begin, ladies first. Why don't we hear a voice that we haven't heard yet in the conference? Professor Atagok, how would you respond to this question in the sense, should governments be involved when it comes to culture? If so, how? And the microphone, we can actually just pass it straight there. Okay, please.
If you look at the history of Turkish culture, there is a westernization period looking up under the Sultanate. Then we are very nationalistic, and we want to be both national and we want to be both Western and national, which is very hard to do. And then another period from 1950 on, we have unification of nationalism with religion. And this we call liberation in cultural institutions, and we closed down actually quite a few of the cultural institutions. And then finally, in the last stage, today, we have a period moving on from west to the east, becoming more Islam. So my story is very negative about the cultural policies of the government. In the Constitution, Article number 63, it states that everything cultural, artifacts, nature, and objects are under the control of the state. And so we have about 100 state museums under the Ministry of Culture and sites, again, under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Then we have private museums starting in the last 5 years. And we are observing that the private museums are more active, more in touch with the public and serving the public more. So therefore there's a tendency to understand that to have a state museum is not really helping the public to appreciate arts. And as far as the policies goes, the policies are changing very rapidly with the political parties changing and taking over. So what is happening at the moment is a change because we have a new party every time. So the people that are working at the museums or at the art institutions or working freely in their private museums are sort of changing as well, along with the changes in the party life and government life. What is to stop the people from saying cultural identity is free to change? I would like to say more settled cultural issues to discuss, and we don't do that in Turkey. I think part of the problem is also economics. The economics is more important for Turkey than culture is, and I believe we have to get over that. I have a negative picture of my country at the moment. Okay.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing those initial reflections with us. Maybe Professor Buttiglione, would you also have a negative view in terms of, let's say, governmental interaction or governmental role? I mean, Italy, of course, has given so many contributions to the European situation and even around the world, as we were commenting about the impact of Italian food on our cultures. But what is your own view in the sense, should governments have a strong role when it comes to culture? If so, what should that role look like?
Well, I cannot answer your question until you answer my question. My question is, how much taxes do Americans pay? What is the higher percentage of their income that they pay to the state?
Much less than in Europe.
Yes, much less than in Europe. In the American system, you are used to think that you have to give money for social purposes. Healthcare was one of the main areas in which money was given. Religion is a main area in which money is given. And culture and art is a main area in which money is given. But if you had to pay, I profoundly admire the generosity of the American people. But if you had to pay more or less 50% of your income to the state, I think you would be less generous with culture and art. So the first problem is to understand that in Europe we have a different system in which people pay much more taxes and therefore expect the state to take care of a lot of things that in America are left to private initiative. Which system is better, I do not know. You have systems in which the state takes care of the cultural heritage, systems in which this is left to the people. In Europe, I would not advocate the American system until we had a drastic tax reform that gives us the resources to imitate the American model. In Europe, we could find a middle way. I much admire the legislation of Austria. Once, when I was younger, I participated in the restoration and recovery of the Gaming Abbey. It is a cradle of Austrian national identity, a very beautiful abbey of the 14th century. And according to Austrian law, if you put 1 shilling in the recovery of a cultural good, the state puts another. It is a system of co-financing, and it is good for the state in 2 senses. One, because private people pay 1/2. But also in another sense, that is, 1/2 through a system of tax shelter and, anyway, 1/2 comes from the state. And the second advantage for the state is that people spending their own money usually spend better, are more worried about the value they get for their money than state authorities. That's a good system. In Italy, we have a system in which you must take into account also the fact that we have, I beg your pardon for my Italian chauvinism, but the largest percentage of cultural goods in the world than any other country. And it is a responsibility to mankind to take care and to protect these cultural goods. Our legislation is centered on the idea of protection as a task of the state. On the other hand, you can make money through those cultural goods if you have a proper administration of those goods. So they attract tourism, so it is a significant resource of the country. People go to the museums and pay a ticket, but even more, you can do a lot of things and make cultural diplomacy through these goods. I give you one example. I had a project to make a museum in Buenos Aires. The project did not work because we lost the elections. I was no more in government, and the new government has left it fall. But it was a very good idea because the idea was on 2010 we have the anniversary of Argentinian independence. And what will Italy do for this anniversary? We give them a museum because Italian culture is a constitutive part of Argentinian culture. And when I say Italian culture, I mean also the Greek heritage, the Roman heritage. So we could give them a museum, give them art collections for a while, then the collections could come back to Italy and be substituted through other art collections. This would have costed us nothing. This would have given us an income, and this would have been a tremendous asset for tourism in Buenos Aires. From all of Latin America, if you wanted to see anything authentic of Roman art or of Greek art, you would have had to come to Buenos Aires. So, and the same we could do with other countries. Today, in many countries, you have cities that did not exist until a few years ago, who have become important, even prominent. Do you know where is Grand Rapids? What was Grand Rapids 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Little more than a village. Today, Grand Rapids is a great city. They want a museum. We, the Italians, could give them the museum. We could give them the art collections under certain conditions. I have made an agreement with the government of the United States that makes it possible, in part, to do this kind of operations. That is the operation that the Louvre has made with Abu Dhabi. The Louvre has made in Abu Dhabi a museum, and they have, in one sense, sold them the museum. The government of Abu Dhabi gives a great palace, and they take care of the collections. We could do that. We have a lot of treasures of art that are not in our museum. They cannot be seen by the people. They are just in the underground. Nobody can see them. We have not even sometimes the money to restore them. So there is also the problem of an active use of this patrimony that we have, and this could give more money than it costs. Of course, you need to rejuvenate. You need a reform. I had the intention of making this reform. I could not do it, with one exception. That was cinema. I think that we should give money for cinema, but in a democratic way. The old system was, we have a commission that judges the movies and says, this is a work of art and deserves support. This is not a work of art and deserves support. It is as if they had made a commission to say, well, Wagner is a work of art. Rock and roll, that's not a work of art. I have changed this, and I said, no, we give a tax shelter to those who invest in the movie industry. And they will have more resources to make good movies, and the people will judge. If you do not like the expression, the market will judge, let us say the people will judge. So I have cut the money to so-called art movies, and what is the result? We used to have an absolute dominance of American movies in Italian theaters. Now we have recovered up to 15% of the market. Now 45% of the Italian market is held by Italians. And the 4 or 5 most important movies in Italy today are all Italians. So it is, I was trying to build an intermediate model, introducing some American elements within a fiscal structure that is roughly different and makes it impossible to have the American model. We have to build up an intermediate system between the American and the completely statalized system that we had in Italy until a few years ago. I shall not say what has happened after I have left the ministry, because I do not want to criticize my successors.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that's a very innovative example to see how one can perhaps find a middle way in terms of how governments cannot necessarily control in terms of saying these films will be funded, but helping to provide access so that actually films can get the support they need. And as you said, the people decide. And I think that's an important question. I think in my introductory remarks, I didn't want to imply that governments should step down and do less in terms of culture. The key question is how they interact. And I think one example would be when a government decides this film or this opera house will get funding. That for me is not so democratic, where actually the government is deciding how that access is actually funded. The policy you mentioned, I think, is a very innovative policy, where actually the government's role is providing access without necessarily controlling which films get the funds. And there I think of the German model of the university, for example, where compared to the U.S., more or less every German citizen has actually access to the university, regardless of economic background, etc. More or less every German citizen can study. That's the government's job, is to provide access to the university. However, every student decides what classes they have, if they want to study law, medicine, this and that. So, the citizens still can decide how to use the access. The government's job is providing the access. And so I think that's what I like about the example you just illustrated. Perhaps as a model we can consider in terms of how governments should deal with this.
May I?
Please.
Well, this model has been studied. I shall not pretend to have the merit of having invented it myself. It is the so-called public choice policy. It has been elaborated in the George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And it has been put to work in many different areas, and as a rule, it did work. This means if the state if there are some social goods, and we want that all people have these goods. Take, for instance, healthcare. We want all people to have healthcare, or we want all people to have university instruction. Not all those who want to have it. And what shall we do? Shall we produce these goods in a socialist system and then distribute them to the public? Or shall we try, in one sense, to make a kind of mimicry of the market? That is, the state provides the money, but we give to the people the choice. And they choose what university they want to go on, which kind of cultural institution they want to attend. And the state pays, up to a certain extent, the costs. It is an innovative model that has worked not only in the limited experiment that I have made, but also in other countries.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hennicot-Schoepges, I'd be very happy to ask you the same question, coming from the point of view of Luxembourg, but I think the other hat that you wear is also the Europe hat, as a member of the European Parliament. What are your own views? Should Europe be involved in culture? If so, how? Should it be left up to national governments, or should it be left up to citizens?
You have to decide whether culture is worth investing by the state. Is it an obligatory expenditure? And I should say yes, absolutely. State has to invest in culture like it invests in health, in transport policy. And what did this investment mean? It has, first of all, to care for infrastructure. If there is no infrastructure, so culture cannot expand, cannot have concerts, cannot have whatever culture means. Is it an obligation of the state to invest in each activity? And that would mean that the state makes a choice. And there I am rather afraid of a state and political parties making a choice of what is going to happen within the cultural infrastructure. So in Luxembourg I built a new Philharmonic Hall. We have built a hall for music for young people, and we delegated the running of these institutions to
a private body that has half of the expenses guaranteed by state money. But what is the program? That's totally run by private people, and the programming has until now been very successful. So the state always is suspicious if he wants to interfere in what is ideological. And I think in Europe we have a shift from the former communist tendency where the state was taking well care of culture and manipulating through cultural activities quite a lot of people, and culture was very high on the expenditure. So that creates a frustration within Europe in new member states. Some colleague of Hungary told me once in the European Parliament, well, formerly we had, in each village we had a choir, and that was no problem. And now that we are in Europe, we have so many orchestras have been abandoned and cannot be financed anymore. And there I come to the difference between the United States. I think we are in between two models of financing. Until now, the European model in many old member states, when I say old member states, it's the former member states of the European Union, as I think we have still a gap. The commercialization of culture was not taken into account by the state. The state did not see culture as a product, with some exceptions, and where culture was really an export highlight, like in Sweden when there was ABBA. It was a second export a product of the whole economy of Sweden. So now you say France is interfering with quotas. I think just as we cannot regulate commerce in other areas with quotas, we cannot regulate the cultural item with quotas. And the quotas in the audiovisual, how is it functioning? After midnight you have all the French films on, and in the best audiences you have the films that are looked at by the public. So your question is very tricky one. How do we see culture? Do we see culture as an economic product? And do we produce culture to earn money? Well, maybe, and it's good if we earn money. On the other hand, it's an absolute obligation for the state to take care of the history, of archaeology, of the monuments, and of the pieces of art, and that's our common goods. And coming to Europe, I think I speak this afternoon more about the European Union. We could improve a lot if we had within the European Union a better cooperation and a better taken in charge of culture. But I have the lecture this afternoon on this. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for those reflections. I think you touched on a very important point also in terms of this risk maybe of the commercialization of culture. Also the question of authenticity in the sense, is it still authentic art if it's funded by a company or if it's funded by a government? If we look at the fastest growing cultural diplomacy institution in the world today, it's actually from China, the Confucius Institute. They have now, I think, 380 Confucius Institutes around the world. What do we make of that? Is that freedom of expression? Is that cultural diplomacy? Is that propaganda? And I wanted to ask the question actually to Ambassador Simonyi before I welcome also our panelist who's just arrived. The question I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Simonyi, was as we talk about rock and roll, would rock and roll have worked if it had been governmentally funded? Would rock and roll have worked if it had been part of a plan of the Confucius Institute to spread, let's say, various ideas from China around the world? Is there a risk sometimes when the governments fund things or get involved? How does this role of governments when it comes to culture interplay with authenticity or creativity in terms of really authentic music being sung? Is there a collision there that we should be aware of or concerned about?
Well, first, I just want to come back to what Erna said. It's very important. In my country, after the changes, we got rid of certain things in cultural policy. Unfortunately, we got rid of the wrong things. Because we basically got rid of financing. It's really not financed the way it used to be financed. We did not get rid of the controls. This is not good. So if you want, just to make my point on I want to make sure you know where I stand on this. In Europe, we will never adopt the American solution entirely, because what emerged in America is really historic, different economy, different. I mean, there are so many things that created this subsidy system for the arts. So we will never adopt it. In Europe, we probably should be heading towards a mixed system. But I want to warn you, we will have to create systems where we can be sure that government financing does not also mean government control. And unfortunately, what you told me about, it's just happening in Hungary. I mean, change of government, change of all the people who are, it's all the policies and the people who are working, the museums and the theaters, etc. Wrong. So don't do that. Now, it's interesting. If you want, I don't think just pouring money into the Confucius Institute will make the difference. So if the Chinese asked me, I would be ready to tell them that just money will not do it, because it does have to have a certain attraction. And there is a reason why our cultural efforts that are basically projecting values that are really close to people's hearts, that is really the platform we can stand on. So if you want government-sponsored rock and roll, will not make the difference. The Russians tried it, by the way, and it didn't work. You wouldn't know this, but there was some there was an East German artist who was really financed by the whole communist bloc. He was a very rich man. He was an American who probably couldn't have made a cent in the United States. His name was Dean Reed. Now, Dean Reed was a disaster musically, and we Hungarians and East Germans, we all hated him. And he always came and toured in Hungary and had no effect, no impact at all. So it's just adapting the form will not make the difference. Just because you pour money into it is not going to make a difference. Let's face it, the Russian cultural diplomacy did score great points, but it was amazingly, it was with ballet, it was this, it was that. But what I want to, just to make sure that you understand, in 1988, and this is really about, and I think this will really answer your question. In 1988, Bruce Springsteen, Sting, Tracy Chapman, and Peter Gabriel came to Hungary as part of the Amnesty International tour, which was the Freedom Tour. It was really about Argentina. It was about, it was an amazing thing. And it was Hungary was the only country in the East where they visited. And it was well, first of all, the authorities were really scared, but I was at that time a junior official, and I really pushed for it because I knew that it will make a difference. Had the U.S. government been behind it, it wouldn't have made the difference. It would have basically sent a message that this is Western propaganda. Anyway, Hungarians and others tried to portray the Amnesty International as just a lackey of the U.S. government, and it's a propaganda tool, but it wasn't, and Hungarians knew it wasn't. And I also want to make sure that you understand those days, this was amazing. It had an amazing impact. Today, and Bruce Springsteen sang Born in the USA to 20,000 Hungarians, and that was amazing. 1988, when we were still not sure whether the wall would come down, there were no guarantees. What I'm trying to say, if Bruce Springsteen would come to Hungary today, it wouldn't make much of a difference. 20 years ago, Bruce Springsteen coming to Hungary with Amnesty International made a huge cultural and political difference. Today it would just be a concert. So I'm just telling you, one should be very, very cautious in understanding how, when, and where we use all these methods. And this is really the answer to the question on the Chinese. Just because they're well funded, because the Confucius Institute will be well endowed, it might not even have the impact of a underfunded small institute like the ICD.
I agree with your comments, in particular about the last comments, but also beforehand. I think there, to try to make sense of, let's say, successful strategies for culture diplomacy, I was recommending to our young leaders earlier this week that they look at 4 points when trying to evaluate whether it's British Council, Confucius Institute, is this successful or not. First point is, what is the agenda, or what is the mission? What are they trying to do? It's not always easy to find this out, but I think that's the first thing we have to get clarity. What is the agenda of this culture diplomacy institution? Secondly, who is the agent? Is it governmental? Is it non-governmental? British Council claims to be non-governmental, but over half of their funding comes from the government. Deutsche Welle, the 4th largest international TV broadcaster in the world, claims to be non-governmental, but I think it's about 98% of its money comes from the government, and it's only broadcast outside of Germany. So the second thing is also very important. Who is the agent? And I think there also the target audience is they want to know. And I think there, as you said, sometimes the agent can impact actually the results of the program itself. The third point that I always try to underline, the vehicle. What is the vehicle of culture diplomacy? Are they just sending jazz musicians to Iraq or to Eastern Europe? Or is it an exchange program? There are many different vehicles of culture diplomacy. Finally, target audience. Are we preaching to the choir, or are we actually reaching those individuals we want to reach? It sounds like Bruce Springsteen, he was reaching the right audiences there, and I think they're the individuals who really did need to receive this message. Very often, culture diplomacy strategies tend to be elitist. We may have even made this mistake ICD this week. Probably everyone in this room is already interested in culture, is already sensitive to culture diplomacy, which is great. It gives us a wonderful potential. But actually much more important are those people who aren't. I think now it's up to 80% of Americans don't have a passport. In the sense, those 80%, those are the ones we have to reach, not the 20% who have a passport who want to come here. So I think that's something we always have to be conscious of when we're developing strategies for culture diplomacy. Who is it that we're reaching out to, and are those the target audiences that we should be reaching out to? And how do we get creative in terms of reaching those audiences that are maybe the hardest to reach? Were you going to add something?
Yeah, I agree. These are the right questions to ask. But just a word on propaganda. I think when it's propaganda, that really misses the point. Whether it's American, West European, or East European communist, it misses the point. And people are bound not to accept propaganda. So that one should be very cautious of the fact that government involvement should not degenerate the cultural activity into sheer propaganda. Sometimes it was very successful. I would say you cannot turn Dizzy Gillespie into a propaganda tool. The bottom line. I mean, it really matters who the agent, who the means of delivery is. I mean, some lousy second-rate artists were propaganda tools, but Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk. I met these guys in Budapest. Made a huge difference, and other Hungarians met them. They were really the agents of freedom and change and freedom of expression. So I just want to echo what you said. If it's propaganda, it kills it. If it's genuinely a vehicle to send the right message of values, freedom, understanding, embracing your culture, then it will work even if it's backed by government.
I agree, and I think there I'm optimistic. I think in today's society it's getting much more difficult to actually do propaganda. I think that's a good thing. I think obviously if you have censorship, if you control the media, this and that, okay, for a certain period of time, perhaps propaganda can go on. But I think the direction I see the world moving in is that it's getting much more difficult, which is good. We have the internet. We have many different ways of finding out different versions of the story. We have WikiLeaks, whether we like it or not. There are many ways in which we can really get many levels of information. So I think that's the good news there, is I think propaganda is much more difficult to do today than it was before. I'd like to now introduce our fifth panelist. I'm very pleased to have the honor of welcoming you here to the Institute and also for the panel discussion, Professor Dr. Timothy Jones. He's the Dean of the Byrne College of Art at Newcastle. He is he holds a degree in Arts and Design and an MA from the Royal College of Art. He has served in a number of academic positions and professorships at various institutions across the entire United Kingdom, including Wimbledon School of Art, Glasgow University, and National University of Ireland. And he has been a guest professor at the Fine Art Zing Academy of Fine Arts. Very much happy that you joined us for this panel discussion. And just to give you a brief resume of what we were discussing up until now, it's really trying to grapple with this issue of governments. Should governments or state-sponsored institutions be involved at all in terms of art and culture diplomacy? And if so, how? Should they be protecting culture? Should they be promoting culture? Should they be doing propaganda? Should they be just trying to facilitate access? What are your own views coming from the UK but also beyond? How should governments get involved, if at all?
Okay, is this on?
Yep.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here, and apologies for my late arrival. This was due to fog at Dublin Airport, so I've come to Berlin for some clarity, and I hope we find it in this conference. On the way, I was reflecting on the title of this panel, and to my mind, this is the panel that interests me most, because I'm speaking as an artist and an art educationist. Whether I'm a cultural diplomat or not, I rather doubt. But so I'll be talking from a particular point of view, and I would hope the contrast, from other people's point of views might be helpful. But in looking at the title, it's a dualistic title. There are two key elements in there, presented, it seems to me, as if there is a natural connection with them, and I'm not sure that there is. The first part is national brands, state-supported cultural institutions. And then there is cultural identity, the role of art and culture in expressing national and cultural identity. From my perspective, there is a really clear line between them. Now, I'm talking from the point of view of somebody who's concerned with the production of art. And on Saturday, when I'm giving a talk, that's the core of what I will be talking about, is the production of art and what international context or internationalism might mean for that. I think whenever you see a duality like that, you should always question it. However engaged you might be in the relationships of the two, whatever the dialogue and dispute might be, I would recommend you question the terms of the expression. And we're in a great place for doing that. We're in Berlin. The most wonderful place in the world for resolving dualisms. The wall came down, and those two immensely contrasting systems found a new relationship from a position when I first came to Berlin to exhibit as an artist in 1971, and the idea that wall was going to come down through anything other than military action would have been unthinkable, and then to come back and find that you can stand in a place and think nothing of it, where before 1989 you would have been shot. I wonder if you know the film Wings of Desire, Wim Wenders' film. A lot of nodding heads. There's a wonderful scene in it in which the two principal characters are standing by the wall talking. And it's on the side of the wall which is painted white, which is to say the east side. And there are a couple of armed guards standing just a few feet away by a jeep, also talking. So they're in between the wall, they're in the dead zone, where those troops have been briefed. You see anybody, you shoot to kill. And they're standing alongside each other, just chatting. And that's a wonderful moment when you realize they don't see them. These guys are invisible. They're outside the terms of reference of the duality of East and West. They're angels. But let's look at that, and I'm going to return to this idea of angels or ghosts when I talk on Saturday. But maybe you should put yourself in that position, because if you don't accept the duality, what else is possible? And wonderful things are possible, as Berlin, as a city, has demonstrated. Now, often you hear in discussion in arts organizations the part that the organizations play in promoting the arts, On the other side, and in the art community, you wonder what these strangers, what kind of connections these strangers have to art. Now, I mean, I've lived and worked in Wales, which is where I come from, in England, in Scotland, and now in the Republic of Ireland. And for a time, I worked at Glasgow School of Art, at a crucial time when Glasgow transformed from being quintessentially a dump into one of the sexiest cities in Europe. And it happened through art. And it happened without planning, without organisation. There were a few other people, a few mavericks. And it was done through a series of projects, but particularly the gaining the status of the European capital of culture. And the provost of the city, who was a very individualistic person, a real maverick, said, "We're going to go for this." And everyone said, "Yeah, you can. We've got better things to do." So one man and his PA applied for that grant and got it. And suddenly then turned around and said, "Well, you didn't want to know about this. We've got a few million pounds to spend. Anybody interested?" And he had based the case on artists. There is a very dynamic artistic culture in Glasgow. That's really where the identity has come about, and it comes from a number of the sort of the informal network of artists and what artists are doing, particularly around the art school. And a number of things happened which helped to crystallise that focus. There was a particular exhibition called The Vigorous Imagination, which was trying to establish a Glasgow identity for Glaswegian artists, and applied for Arts Council funding and were turned down. But there were enough enthusiasts involved to make it work. And almost overnight, this one exhibition presented a kind of identity, a Glasgow style, which drew heavily on German expressionism, in fact, which had the mission of declaring a cultural identity, not just for Scotland, but for Glasgow in particular. And later, the Arts Council were very proud of this exhibition and their role in it, which is to say they didn't have one. Also, within that, the dynamic within that, the artist community was very important, very interesting. There was an artist called Douglas Gordon, a younger generation than the artists exhibiting in The Vigorous Imagination, who said, "There's nothing Scottish about Scottish art. There's nothing Glaswegian about Glaswegian art. This is a fabrication. It's a brand. Glasgow artists should aim to be artists in whatever terms it means to be artists. What should make them different is to aim to be the best in the world." And that was his huge contribution. Got an enormous amount of attention. There was a movement in the music community in Glasgow, and there's, like most major cities, a significant number of major pop musicians produced. In Glasgow, this culture developed. We're going to make it internationally, and we're going to stay at home. And in particular, that was a band called Wet Wet Wet, who never moved. They're still there. But they are in every city and in the top 10 in many major countries over recent years. And they're not quite there now, but there you go. In Ireland, the national agencies that promote Irish culture make big claims about the role of the arts, particularly literature, in Irish identity, and promote that really vigorously. Most, not all, but most of the major Irish writers that they're talking about have been banned at one time or another in Ireland. A significant number of them moved abroad, not because they didn't like home and wanted to find inspiration elsewhere, but because they couldn't work at home. James Joyce was banned. John McGahan, Samuel Beckett is now regarded as one of Ireland's major writers. You go to France, and he's regarded as one of France's major writers. It's interesting, because you're talking about some of the American connection there. There's a very famous contemporary abstract painter called Sean Scully. In Ireland, he's regarded as one of Ireland's principal major painters. If you go into any museum of modern art in America, you will find some of his work. He's one of those guys who's represented almost universally across the board. They'll have his name and his dates American, because he went there after being a student and stayed there, but keeps the connection coming home. So huge claims are made about what the state does for art and how art contributes to the state. But there's an act of appropriation there.
It's a two-way street, definitely.
Sorry?
It's a two-way street there, and I think you'd argue sometimes the informal ambassadors can even have more of an impact than the formal.
That's right.
Did you want to add something else? Or
No,
Okay.
I've thrown my few pennyworth in, so...
No, it's, I think, some very vivid examples. I'm just looking, unfortunately, at the watch, and I'm debating here food for the mind and food for the stomach. We had scheduled a lunch break from 1 o'clock until 2:30. It's now 1:15. So what I'd suggest is, if you would agree, let's maybe take 2 or 3 question statements. I just want to at least give a chance some voice from the audience without interfering too much with the schedule, and then perhaps a brief closing comment from each of the panelists, and we can try maybe even in 5 or 10 minutes to bring that to a conclusion. It's a shame because there's so much material here that I really would love to go deeper in, but I would like to at least hear a few voices from the audience. So my colleague Pete has a microphone. I see there's already 2 hands here. I would suggest maybe let's take a total of 3 comments, questions. Keep them brief if you can. As always, say your name and briefly stand up to introduce yourself. Why don't we maybe start in the front? Or, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Anishka Perlman. I'm a musician, and I'm also a freelance contributor for National Public Radio. I have 2 observations that I'd like commentary on. One is I'm Swedish as well, and I'm a member of the Musicians Union in Sweden, and I'm familiar with Sweden as using music as an export commodity. And while this is true, and it's given a lot of revenue to Sweden, it's actually also a monopoly. There's a very few select people who are those creators and producers of that export commodity, which I see as sort of sad. And secondhand, it doesn't make room for a lot of fresh blood. And the second thing is that in Sweden, while we have a lot of sponsorship for projects, it's a very archaic, it's always the same people from the last 20 years. So I think what I've noticed as a part Swede is Sweden is partly successful because it's very protectionist about its export commodity, which goes a little bit against the spirit of sharing in cultural diplomacy, to my impression. That's my first commentary, and I would love to hear what you might think are the dangers, or if that's not true, and so forth. And the second thing is about the dualism, which you broached upon. I also think I'm a proponent for the subculture. So in Berlin, I always go check out the subculture, what's happening on the subculture scene, because you asked, Mark, whether rock and roll, if government-funded rock and roll could have helped change anything. I personally would say no, because the point of rock and roll was to question the government and offer an alternative and offer some resistance in a dialectic. And so anything that's funded by a government eventually is going to have to meet resistance somewhere, and I think you need the subculture for that. Those were my 2 comments.
Thank you. And question number 2, right there, please.
It's a totally unrelated question. I'm Pavel, and I work in opera. And I wanted to come back to Erna Hennicot-Schoepges' point that you made about how important it is to invest in the infrastructure of art, because it's an investment in the creativity of people. And we've heard how important creativity is in the future. And I wanted to ask Dr. Buttiglione, because with regards to opera, because you talked a lot about how important art is and might be as a kind of ambassador for Italian national identity. And Italy used to be the land of opera, and that's where opera kind of generated from and originates from. And to me, it's very astonishing how actually in Italy opera kind of has completely dried up. There are a few houses, but it's the repertoire system. There are not that many, or not at all, any singers coming from Italy, and it's not a living tradition. In Germany, there are new works being performed, being done, and in Italy, that is just not, and that is not the case. And I wanted to know some of the reasons why that is the case, why you're not supporting opera in your country, or why are you supporting it in a way that doesn't allow for a living art form. So that's basically my question.
Thank you. Is there a last question? Maybe here to the right, yeah. Please.
My name is Sarah. I'm from the States, and I wanted to build off the last question and maybe take a broader view, not only in protecting culture and cultural heritage, but there's something that's identifying in what's rejected and no longer supported, either by the government or by the public, what people choose to spend their money on, and where they, if they go to the opera, or if they go to a dance performance, or if they go to the orchestra, and what they're paying to hear and see, says something about who we are now as a particular culture or society or community. But at the same time, it was also mentioned access. When are you just preaching to the choir and people that haven't been exposed to a wide variety of the art in order to, this is a controversial statement, but to make an informed decision about what they're supporting and what they're not supporting. So I guess a comment on not only protecting, but also the ability to reject what has come in the past and to no longer support it, and how that plays into this whole sense of cultural identity.
Thank you very much. Now I would ask maybe each of the panelists to give maybe a brief response, not necessarily to all of the questions, but if there's one that you feel is particularly fitting, and in doing so, maybe a closing statement. And I'd ask everyone to keep it brief, just so we can stay as close to schedule as possible. Let's ladies first again. Maybe we'll start with my left, and then we'll move to the right. Ms. Hennicot-Schoepges.
Thank you. Yes, concerning financing and giving subsidies, having been for 9 years a minister responsible to give subsidies, sometimes it's a very crucial question, but you have never money enough to give everybody what they want, and it is not good either. The best model I have seen is the model of Quebec. The state gave the money, all the amount of money, to a private body that is appointed for 3 years and changing, and this private body is taking advice on a delegation of the producers that makes all the halls and cinemas, and of the artists, so regisseurs and artists. And they are advising, and there is a discussion about who gets subsidy, who gets a loan with interest, a loan without interest, and who gets a risk capital. So there is a lot of possibilities, and that provides good producers making good products can apply on this, but are not totally taken in charge. And there the government is totally out. I think this is the most valuable model for. But of course, you have, as a minister, you cannot say, well, I give you, and you have not the benefit of having the thanks, but you have done something over party level to finance condition. Concerning infrastructure, and the question, very interesting question of opera. Opera is the most expensive, and I would have not agreed to introduce opera in Luxembourg. We have now opera. We have it in co-production with Belgium, and with the Monet, and all the best productions are happening in Luxembourg. So this cooperation trans-border is profiting to everybody, and I think I noticed infrastructure is before the demand. Normally you have a demand and you have an offer after. And in culture it functions the other way around. If there is no offer, there is no demand. We had a concert hall built, and everybody told me, you are crazy to build this hall, it will never be filled. There are halls in Metz and all around you never will fill. Now our Philharmonic Hall has 250 concerts a year, sometimes 3 concerts a day, a large program for children. And the program for children is exported to Moscow and to those countries who have a big problem of rebuilding up classical culture for children. So infrastructure, that's the problem of the state. I think that were the questions to answer.
Thank you very much. Professor Buttiglione, please.
I would like to say one word on rock and roll and museums. I think we need some rock and roll in our museums. One fundamental problem we have in Italy is that we have the greatest number and the greatest quality of objects of art, but we have not adequate conditions for the fruibility, that is, for the possibility of people to understand what they are seeing. And we need somebody who can run a museum with a little bit of humor, with a narration, giving an adequate narrative, and helping people to understand. Because otherwise people go, watch, and do not see, or they have the prescribed emotions because they are prescribed, not because they feel it really. And that is one fundamental problem, because the cultural heritage is something that belongs to the nation and to the deepening of the identity of the nation, but also of men as such. Because many tourists come, and they are not interested so much in deepening the meaning of Italian identity, as rather in deepening the meaning of their human identity. This is a terrible problem, and I think if we could solve this problem, we would have much more people going to the museums, and we could make also much more money, and we would not have so many problems with financing our cultural sector. I give you one example. I have 5 grandchildren, and I went to the Museum of Roman Tradition at Euro in Rome, and I started talking to the children, explaining them what they were seeing. And after a while, there was a lot of people around me, because nobody explained them what really was there. What is the story? Because each object represents a story. If you do not tell the story, one watches and does not understand. So there is one fundamental issue. Second problem, opera. Why is Italian opera decaying? Well, Italian opera costs too much. Opera costs a lot of money. Italian opera costs even more because we have a tradition of great artists. Let us make one name, Zeffirelli, who, I am politically incorrect. Zeffirelli is a great artist. He is used to working without taking note of the budget. What is the budget? Why an artist should know the meaning of the word budget? He just spends money and expects somebody to pay, which is not good. So I tried to introduce a reform that I could not complete. The reform should be made reducing the number of opera houses. It is terrible, very difficult, but you cannot imagine that we finance 14 foundations for opera in Italy. This is 14. 14. What?
In Germany, it's like, I don't know, it's less than 100, but
No. Wait a minute. I say that we fund as state the way of financing of the German I am glad we have much more than 14 opera theaters. Most of them live without state support. So we can have 1, 2, 3, 4 national theaters supported by the state, but no more. And the others, I don't advocate their distraction. I say the region, the city, private sponsors should take care of them, and we should create the conditions that make it possible, as I did with cinema. That is, giving tax shelter and the possibility of having a seat in the council of the opera house, and so forth. This is one aspect of the problem. Another aspect of the problem regards an effect. If we do this, if the reform had been completed, we would have had also a profound change in the kind of opera that is played. Because when the state pays, it is much easier to make brilliant experiments of musical archaeology. How many of you know what is the Count of St. Bonifacio? It is an opera of Verdi, almost unknown. If you have to make the money to pay the expenses, you are more likely to make Nabucco or to make I Lombardi alla Prima Crociata, and much less likely to make those operations of cultural archaeology that are very sophisticated but do not attract the public. There is another problem. A third problem, we should give more importance to music and less weight to all the rest, because a large part of the costs come not from the music, come from the allestimento. That is, the fact that you have to set up an extraordinary machinery that costs a lot of money and does not contribute much to the enjoyment of music. I do not pretend to impose my opinion, but if you want it, you have to pay for it. You cannot expect the state to pay. Up to a certain extent, you can expect the state to pay for good music, but not for the paraphernalia. Another aspect regards the support to music out of the foundations. We must support music that is called, let us say, free music. And we must support free music following and not anticipating or contradicting the judgment of the public. The Austrian model, I think that I have experienced in the case of Gaming Abbey, I think is good also for the opera. You make one euro, I give you another euro. You don't make any euros, I don't give you anything. This will compel people who make music to stand in contact with the demands of the people. Another element of the crisis of opera is the problem of musical alphabetization. We used to have parish churches having a choir and teaching people the fundamentals of music. Now, to a large extent, this is not true. We used to have a system of bands in the towns, and they made an important function of alphabetization. We don't have them anymore. I wanted to introduce in Italy the experiment, the experiment of Venezuela. You know, in Venezuela, Mr. Abreu, what he has done with street music. Well, we need something like that in order to restart the process of alphabetization, because you will never have a large public for, let us say, for Anton Webern, if you do not have musical alphabetization, a lot of Verdi and Puccini and Rossini and Donizetti and so forth, and then you can, in the end, select a public that is interested also to Anton Webern or dodecaphonic music and so forth. It was a project. Of this project, very little has been left, and in the last years we have had only one element has been taken into account: the need to reduce the expenditures of the state, without providing the instruments to substitute for those expenditures those of the private donors, those of the cities, without making a program for musical alphabetization and so forth. So we are in the middle of a great crisis, especially, and I must say, I delivered a very strong speech in Parliament against the minister, because with the cuts that he has made, we can expect the Italian opera to die in the coming year, or if not to die, to be reduced in a very bad shape, much worse than it is now. I want to make one last remark on cultural diplomacy. Look, I want to tell you one example, one story. You know that we are not on very good terms with the Iranians. We have had a lot of clashes, problems, and we don't understand each other, and we have been in certain moments on the verge of war. Perhaps we are still. Do you know who was the only minister that the Iranians were happy to receive in any moment? Me. the Italian minister for art. And you know why? Because there was the earthquake in Iran, and the cradle of Iranian national identity, the citadel of Om, was destroyed. And we have, I beg your pardon for my chauvinism, the best school of restoration in the world.
No, Hungarian is better.
No, no, I don't think so. L'Istituto Centrale del Restauro. And we have been restoring the citadel of Om. And it is an instrument of cultural or foreign policy, of cultural diplomacy that is extraordinary. We have been rebuilding the Great Wall in China and the Palace of Supreme Harmony always in China. And this allows you to create contacts, even in the most difficult moments, not only beyond cultural barriers, but also beyond political barriers. It allows you to go and talk and to say one word. In the beginning, it will not have a great effect, but with time, it may have a great impact. Also, in this sense, cultural diplomacy may be an instrument of peace to cut across cultural barriers and to spread a word of peace.
Thank you very much. Professor Atagok, I'd be very pleased to hear your closing remarks and responses also to the questions. Maybe, András, if you could just pass the microphone there.
Sure. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
I am here for the interest, for increasing or raising the interest of the public more than anything else. We can produce art, we can make music, we can sing opera. What if we do not have enough audience to get to? Then I don't think we have really used our benefits for the all. What happens in Turkey is that the museums have barely started to notice that there is something called audience other than the tourists. Our big money comes from the tourists to the big museums like St. Sophia or Topkapı Palace or Efes. The money goes to the ministry. And the ministry, and we also pay as owners of houses, 8% on the value of our houses to the ministry every year. So there's a big pocket where the money is collected. So what happens to that money? The money is paid for the restoration of the sites. I understand that. We have to upkeep our historical heritage. But this money also goes to movie makers, good or bad, and I don't know what kind of relations they do with the ministry. And then the opera singers or the ballet dancers that's under the national companies do get money for productions that never take place. They are monthly paid people, salaries, you know. I'm paid as a teacher, I'm working every day, going to the school, whereas they only perform just maybe 1 month out of the 12 months we have. So the money is spent by the decisions of the people in the ministry. But then, luckily, we have banks. Banks support artistic activities, theaters for the children, theaters for the adults, theaters going to Anatolia, to the Far East, for 1 month, and on the way meeting the people there. I think we need more involvement with the public, and that's what we are not doing in our ministries, mainly because they are not really people like you are. They are not interested in culture so much, so they are people there that are there for political reasons, and I want that to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Simonyi.
Thank you. Without subculture, there is no arts. So let's be on the safe side. Before rock and roll became mainstream. And before it was destroyed by the big stadiums and it was destroyed by big business. It was an underground subculture, cutting edge. So I just want to make sure that a society which does not understand that mainstream legacy culture is a result of earlier subcultures, that society will not be able to create new cutting edge art. And by the way, that's something probably people in Scotland understood. I mean, I'm fascinated by this. Would you please come to Budapest and tell this story? By the way, Professor, one of the best museums in the world I've seen is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum in Cleveland, which I have the honor to be the only Hungarian who has donated an instrument. My guitar is there. That's bragging. But it's a German Framus from 1961. It's a red German Framus from 1961, which I've had forever, and I think this was the right place to put it. But I want to say that I think, why is it that Europeans have not come to that museum is a first-class museum with top experts, with great instruments, and they have collected only instruments, forget mine, only instruments that have been historically important in the rock and roll history. Like, for example, Bruce Springsteen's first guitar, Paul McCartney's, suit for the Sgt. Pepper's photo. So I'm just saying that it only proves that rock and roll has grown up. If a museum like that of a high quality can be created, it means that rock and roll has grown up. And let me turn it around, and it cuts into something that we have been discussing, state and non-state and private. I'm now working with a Hungarian private museum, and we are bringing in a poster exhibition from the San Francisco era, 66, 69. And that exhibition I would not have been able to find support in the Hungarian government to have this exhibition. And I'm telling you, this will be one of the most exciting exhibitions. Original prints, original from the family dog and the what's his name, the Bill Graham organization, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, the Yardbirds, etc. And why I'm saying this is that, yes, it's time for rock and roll to grow up and become part of the high culture in a good way. Finally, let me tell you, I'm always obsessed with trying to explain there's nothing wrong with rock and roll and there is no real difference between classical music and rock and roll. You've heard of Yo-Yo Ma? Okay, Yo-Yo Ma is probably the greatest cellist, or maybe one of the greatest cellists. And we had dinner together, and we started talking about music, and he said, "Oh, Ambassador, are you a musician?" "Well, no, I'm just a rock and roll musician." "Are you crazy? Every Saturday I go off and play with my rock and roll band."
Professor Jones, please.
Thank you. Yeah, just a few thoughts. Culture comes out of art. By art, I mean the whole range of the arts. And it comes out of a dynamic in which one generation replaces another. And that is, I think, the important part of subculture. But it is only a part. So, for example, at the moment, internationally, there's this huge development in the number of artists, visual artists, around. Of course, can't get representation, even less likely to get taken up by any of the major museums. There's a sort of unspoken rule that there are only room for 80 major artists in the world at any one time, meaning, of course, that's what the art market can support. And that's the bit we haven't had in this dualism here. The audience, as you rightly indicate, and the market forces. So there's a dynamic there, and the relationship of all of that to, or rather the relationship of state organizations to that, is something which is heavily politicized, and those people in state organizations who feel they have some responsibility for the development of the art could do well to rethink what they're doing. The one piece of political action that I've seen which really has helped to promote the arts was by the Irish government a number of years ago, when they just took a step back and just said, we won't charge artists of any kind income tax on their work. So if you're so for example, U2 are not taxed on their songwriting. They're taxed on their CDs and the performances and the rest. I'm not taxed on selling my drawings. I am on the income out from being a teacher. But it had an enormous effect. It brought a huge number of artists to Ireland. It made the west coast of Ireland, from north to south, a heavily international culture, because that's where house prices were lowest. There's a similar kind of dynamic in Berlin, in that until recently, accommodation on the eastern side of the city was just so much cheaper than anywhere else. Not much chance of developing an income in Berlin, but certainly being able to live with low cost. So reducing the cost of living is something that state organizations can do wonderfully, in a way that no other agency can. But your comment about state, the idea of state promotion of jazz or rock and roll has been sort of haunting me for a little bit in the last few minutes. It was the state that made abstract expressionism, action painting, what it was in the 1950s, because there was a historic moment when America was looking for its own unique cultural identity, and it found it in the most unlikely, most radical element of the arts at that time. I mean, they look like classic masterpieces these days, but these were the wild men of art who got promoted by the CIA initially, and then other organizations. Made a huge contribution to American identity. And so I think I'll just close on these last points of cultural identity around art, and the effect of the economy, which we haven't been discussing as such, is centered on location. An economy will boom in a location where people want to be, and artists can give that location that identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I really appreciated the panel discussion today. I think on the one hand, we were singing in the same orchestra, so to speak, or playing in the same orchestra, but I think we saw a variety of rhythms and songs, to use the analogy. I think really a wealth of different experiences and perspectives. I really feel I benefited a lot, and I'd like to thank also from my side the panelists for this discussion. So please, if you could join me in a very warm round of applause for the panelists. Thank you. Okay.